Hi, this is Chris Young. Welcome to episode 64 of Contemplating Life. This week we continue with my reminiscence of my college days at IUPUI studying computer science, especially stories surrounding my mentor, Dr. John Gersting, and his wife, Dr. Judith Gersting. We now continue with my 6th semester at IUPUI. My transcript says I took Math 361, Advanced Calculus, and Differential Equations. By now the math was getting pretty hairy, and I never really got a good feel for calculus and diffeq. I snuck by with a D. I also took Physics 342, Modern Physics, which involved Einstein's special and general relativity, as well as quantum mechanics. While I enjoyed the lab portion of the class, I never could wrap my head around the quantum mechanics. The more I learned about relativity, the less impressed I became with Einstein. He had this pop culture image of being an amazing genius. But I learned, as is the case in all scientific pursuits, much of what he did was simply an extension of the work of the people before him. We learned about the famous Michelson-Morley experiment, which proved that the speed of light in a vacuum is constant. As a consequence of that experiment, Dutch physicist Heinrich Lorentz derived the famous Lorentz transformation formulas, which describes how time dilates and length changes as you approach the speed of light. I had always thought these derivations came from Einstein, but actually they came from Lorentz as a result of Michelson and Morley. The problem was nobody understood the real significance of Lorentz or Michelson and Morley. It took Einstein, who had the courage to throw out a bunch of preconceived ideas of how physics worked, to really understand the significance of these previous discoveries. Then that led him to develop both special and general relativity. So while I give him props for following the data where it led him, despite the fact that he blew up centuries of science before that, Einstein really didn't do anything that great, in my opinion. Furthermore, as a third-year college physics student, I was expected to fully understand relativity. Now, none of us in that class, especially me, could be described as a physics genius. Yet I came away from it with a pretty good understanding of relativity. Now, relativity is bizarre and counterintuitive, but once someone figured it out, it does not take a genius to understand it. It just takes a well-educated college physics student. So where's the genius in that? I didn't do very well when it came to quantum mechanics. The idea that something could simultaneously be a particle and a wave is something that physicists still can't explain to this day. And the idea that particles don't actually exist, that they only have a probability of existing, that was a problem that even Einstein couldn't accept. He said, God doesn't throw dice. My problem is, if something was an electromagnetic wave, what was the medium of that wave? Sound waves travel through the medium of air. Ocean waves travel through the medium of water. What is the medium of electromagnetism? What is the medium of light? Scientists used to believe it was something they called the ether. Electromagnetic waves were thought to be vibrations in this invisible medium. But Michelson and Morley proved that there is no ether. I wanted to bring back the concept of ether. I just couldn't wrap my head around the idea of vibrating energy without a medium. Now, I was way off base, but in some ways, I may have been ahead of my time. I think I was on the verge of inventing string theory. String theory is the idea that all matter consists of vibrating strings of energy. String theorists don't say what the strings are made of, so the problem persists. Whether it's vibrating strings or electromagnetic waves, what exactly is the medium? What is it that's vibrating? No one can tell me. Now, although the origins of string theory date back to around 1943, it wasn't until 1984 that physicists started to get excited when they discovered that string theory could accurately model all of the elementary particles of the standard model of physics, as well as the interaction between them. Proponents of string theory have yet to produce anything useful. It seems to be the general consensus that there's no experiment you can do to prove string theory. So although it has some interesting potential, it has not yet fulfilled its promise. They keep saying a breakthrough is 10 years away, and they've been saying that since the 1980s. People who work on string theory are often ridiculed by mainstream physicists these days. Check out the link in the description of a debate between Neil deGrasse Tyson and Brian Greene. Tyson is a big critic of string theory because it hasn't produced any results. Brian Greene just says, well, this is a really hard problem, and we're still working on it. Yeah, but you're not getting anywhere. Had I been better at math and physics, I might have gotten into the field of string theory and spent decades producing nothing useful. Fortunately for me, I was getting D's in calculus and differential equations, and I got so confused in this modern physics class that I ended up withdrawing from it. This was the only class I did not complete in college. Somewhere along the way, the School of Science changed its basic requirements for a degree. They lowered some of the liberal arts requirements, which I had already met. For example, I could have gotten by with just 2 semesters of foreign language instead of 3. I don't remember the rest of the details, but it was to my advantage to switch to the new curriculum. I think it saved me an additional couple of liberal arts classes, but it meant I had to take a class in public speaking. I really enjoyed that class. It earned me a B. I could tell you more stories about it, but it really wasn't that interesting for our storytelling purposes. And besides, we want to get back to the main topic, and that's my computer classes under my mentor, Dr. Judith Gersting. CS 461, Programming 3, was the class I talked about last week, in which Gersting told us we had to teach ourselves the course. The title of the book that he wrote was Algorithmic Languages. It was a brief survey of, I believe, 5 or 6 computer languages. There were a few introductory chapters, and then a chapter on each language. At the end of each chapter, there was a programming assignment. And as I mentioned before, there were quizzes and tests that you had to pass 100% before you could go on. The only deadline was we had to complete the course by the end of the semester. He posted a chart outside his office that showed where everyone in the class was. A semester lasted 15 weeks. There was one guy who finished the entire course in about 3 or 4 weeks. We all considered him a show-off or a brown nose. All of the rest of us, including me and my friend Rich, went through the course at a leisurely rate. We would look at the chart and notice that we were all in approximately the same position. It didn't occur to us until almost too late that we were not going to finish in time. Comparing ourselves to one another was a really bad idea, because we were all doing terribly. Now, the book that Gersting wrote was a phenomenal reference book, We began referring to it as the Bible, because it had all the answers. Then one day I said, actually it's not the entire Bible. It's just the Gospel according to John Gersting. I wrote that across the top of my book, but I don't know if he ever saw it. There was one programming assignment, in Programming 3, where I got a D on the assignment from Gersting. I tried to raise the negative number to an exponent that was the floating point number. For example, if you take 2 to the power of 2, that's just 2 squared, which equals 4. Similarly, you can take minus 2 to the power of 2, and that also equals 4. No problem. Now suppose you take 9 to the power of 0.5. That's just the square root, so the answer is 3. But now what if you try to take minus 9 to the power of 0.5? You can't do that. Mathematically, it's undefined. You can't take a negative number to an exponent that's fractional. The compiler, or the runtime system, should have created an error, but it didn't. It gave an answer of minus 3. So essentially, it took the square root of plus 9 and then just tacked on the minus sign. I complained when he gave me a D. I said, the compiler and the runtime system let me do it. His response was, if the guy who wrote the compiler or the runtime system was in my class, I would have flunked him. But instead, you get a D. Are you still going to pass this class, despite one low grade on one project out of a dozen? Yeah. Are you ever going to raise a negative number to a floating point exponent again? No. Case closed. The D stands. The bottom line is, he was very tough, but he was also fair. I came up with the adage, the only thing more difficult than the guy who thinks he wrote the book on the subject is the guy who actually did write the book on the subject. Rich later amended that theory. He topped it when he went to an advanced math class, and on the first day the teacher had them open up the textbook and read the acknowledgments page. The author thanked someone for proofreading the book and catching many errors. The proofreader was Rich's math professor. So Rich said, worse than the guy who thinks he wrote the book on the subject, and worse than the guy who actually did write the book on the subject, is the guy who was so smart he could catch the mistakes of the guy who wrote the book on the subject. Well, he had me there. One of the most significant events in my relationship with Dr. Gersting occurred one day when I went to his office to give him a progress report on my independent study project. Unfortunately, there wasn't much to report. I was lagging way behind on the project. Anyway, when I offered to fill him in on my progress, such as it was, he said he was on his way to the teacher's lounge to eat dinner, invited me to sit with him and talk. Now, it's not like I was being let into some super secret off-limits area, but it wasn't somewhere that students normally went. I gave my report, such as it was, and then he started talking about the students in our other class. I don't remember the name of the student he was talking about. We'll call him Joe. Did you notice Joe hasn't been in class lately, he noted. Yeah, now that you mention it. Is he sick? No, he's dropping out. His wife is expecting their first child. He took a job writing COBOL for an insurance company. He felt like he had to take it. I should explain that type of job was considered some sort of bottom of the barrel for computer programmers, especially computer science majors. You could sense how disappointed that Gersting was. He stared into space for a moment, and then continued, My worry is he'll never come back to complete his education. You're fortunate that your education is being paid for because of your handicap, and you don't have responsibilities distracting you from your education. Suddenly, I saw a completely different side of a man. He was so hard on us because he wanted the best for us. I realized how deeply he cared for his students. He cared about their life and their career. And furthermore, he cared about me. He was thinking about my future. Now, as I mentioned, I was struggling to complete the independent study project. And furthermore, my Programming 3 class was not going well either. Part of the purpose of the course was to teach us self-discipline. In the real world, you only have one deadline: finish the entire project on time. We kept looking at that chart, thinking we were doing as well as everyone else. But when it came down to the wire, we were all in trouble. By the way, Gersting once said, "I don't think God created the world in 6 days. I think he thought about it for 5 days and then pulled an all-nighter." Who knows, maybe being a procrastinator comes with being a programmer. We pulled lots of all-nighters to finish on time. That's why I was so sympathetic to that gal who hired me to help her with her last-minute programming assignments I talked about a couple of episodes ago. The computer room was always packed in the final days of the semester. It was hard to find a free teletype machine to log on. I remember sitting there with Rich just a couple of hours before the final deadline. I had barely gotten my last program finished. Rich had his program working, but all he needed to do was print out a final copy. The teletype he was working on broke down. It would print okay, but at the end of each line, it would do a carriage return, but not the line feed. It would not advance the paper. It just kept overprinting on the top of the same text over and over again. You had to guess when it was going to do a carriage return, and then quickly crank the knob by hand. The result was a printout that wound all over the page, but at least you could read it. With just minutes to spare, we rushed from the computer room in the A building across the street to Gersting's office in the K building. There was a line of students trying to turn things in at the last minute. I remember Gersting looking at Rich's output and saying, "What the hell happened here?" Rich explained about the broken teletype. I don't know what grade Rich got, but I think he did okay, and I ended up with a B for the semester. This semester was undoubtedly the most difficult semester I had. In addition to this programming class, I had that failed independent study project with Gersting. I barely got the job done, and I wrote a ridiculously brief report. He could have easily failed me, or maybe given me an incomplete, but he didn't. The pressure of having to drop my physics class, getting a poor grade in calculus, rushing to complete Programming 3, and doing a piss-poor job in my independent study class nearly led me to a nervous breakdown. A couple of years later, when I graduated and finally got a full-time job, people asked me if it was going to be hard to work full-time. I said, hell no. 40 hours a week will be a piece of cake compared to what I've been through. College is a 24/7 endeavor. There's always a chapter you could reread. There's always a program you could have written better. There's always another test you should cram for. Even when you think you've gotten everything done, you haven't. The pressure is constant. Being able to walk away from a job at 5 p.m. each day and leave it behind me until the next day, and have my weekends completely free, is going to be magnificent compared to what I've been through in college. The following semester, I had a class with Dr. John Gersting's wife, Dr. Judith Gersting. It was called Discrete Computer Structures CS 482. Now, it wouldn't be the first day in class with a Dr. Gersting without me getting shrouded, like Mr. Hart did, by Professor Kingsfield in the paper chase. This time was no exception. Before the first class began, one of my classmates and I were talking. He said, "Hey, Chris, how'd that independent study project go with Dr. G?" It was a disaster. I barely got any reasonable amount of work done. I ended up throwing together a report at the last minute and turning it in. He gave me a C for the course. Then I heard a voice calmly declare, "It was a gift, you know." I said, "What?" I turned around and I looked. Standing at the front of the classroom was Dr. Judith Gersting. "It was a gift that he gave you a C." Yeah, I know that. It was a gift. I did know it was a gift. He could have flunked me. Inside, I was freaking out. I had a new version of the worst teacher scenario. It's not so bad when a teacher writes a book on the subject. It's not even so bad when your teacher is so smart they can correct the mistakes of the guy who wrote the book on the subject. Worse than all of that is when you have teachers who are married to one another, and you're the subject of conversation between them. My reputation was preceding me, and it wasn't a good one. Now, in retrospect, it was arguably a positive thing. Mr. Dr. G had my best interests at heart. He knew I'd done poorly, but he wasn't going to crash my GPA or have me come up short and not graduate on time. I probably deserved a D rather than a C. I didn't really deserve an F because I did complete the work, but it was seriously substandard. The fact that he was willing to give me a break, knowing that I would do better in the future, should have been a positive. Furthermore, the fact that he communicated that to Mrs. Dr. G was arguably also a positive. But it was hard to see that at the time. At the moment, I just felt like it was the opening day, and I had been shrouded by Mrs. Kingsfield. This course with Mrs. Dr. G was a highly advanced computing theory class. We discussed things like Turing machines, which were a hypothetical computer invented by computing pioneer Alan Turing. His life was chronicled in the 2014 film The Imitation Game. Turing was played by Benedict Cumberbatch. He was a mathematician who invented a machine that cracked the German Enigma code and saved thousands of lives in World War II. Yet he was later stripped of all his honors when it was discovered he was a homosexual. He ended up killing himself. I had drawn a cartoonish image of a Turing machine on the front of my notebook, and that caught the eye of Mrs. Dr. Gersting. She thought it was kind of cute. I did eventually warm up with her. I'll never forget a homework assignment I had in her class. It was the most challenging yet rewarding assignment I had in my 4.5 years of college. It simply said, showed that there are only two non-isomorphic groups of order 4. Now, unless you had some advanced math or computability courses, you're probably completely clueless about what that sentence means. And at the time, so was I, and several of my classmates. Some of them were graduate students taking the class. For me, the course was called CS 482. But for the grad students, it was called CS 582. The undergrads and the grads took the same course together. Now, without going into a bunch of mathematics that's unimportant, let me give you a brief overview. There's this mathematical concept called a group. It's a way to take a set of objects as operators and perform some function upon them, to combine them together and come out with an answer that is also a member of that group. Rather than try to explain it all here, I found a YouTube video that solves this exact question in almost precisely the way that I and my fellow students finally figured it out. It took us hours to do so, but there was a phenomenal sense of satisfaction that we had taken on such an obscure problem and managed to figure it out. When I did a Google search in preparation for this podcast, I found lots and lots of web pages and YouTube videos attempting to answer this exact same question, so it must still be a standard question for such courses today. The question said, show that there are only two non-isomorphic groups of order 4. It didn't necessarily say prove it, because in a way you don't prove it. It said show it, and we did show it. It's not like proving a regular theorem. It's something that simply is. You illustrate it. You demonstrate it. Some things are just true, and you can demonstrate they're true. Some things are false, and you can demonstrate that. This led me to create what I called Young's Theorem. The theorem states, if it is, it is, and if it isn't, it isn't. The proof is it? Well, then it is. Is it not? Well, then it's not. Okay, that's silly and ridiculously trivial. I understand that. But it was my expression and my satisfaction that we took a wildly hypothetical, marginally useful mathematical question and came up with an answer, when my initial assessment was, I had no idea what the fuck they were asking. By the way, I got an A from Mrs. Dr. Gersting, and believe me, I earned it. That was no gift. We worked hard in that class, and it was rewarding. And that led me to the understanding, for the most part, you can figure things out. True things are true. False things are false. Well, naturally, it's more complicated than that. In fact, later in the course, we learned there's an entire class of problems that cannot be solved by an algorithm. It's called computability theory. Some things cannot be solved by a computer. The primary example is, you cannot write a computer program that will analyze another computer program to tell you definitively if that program will complete its task and stop. It's sort of the mathematical equivalent of the question, if God is all-powerful, can he create an object so massive that he can't lift it? If he could create such an object, then he's not all-powerful because he can't lift it. If he cannot create an object, then he's not all-powerful. It's sort of like that paradox, what happens when an immovable object meets an unstoppable force. It's just a paradox. Years later, paradoxes like this led me to create a joke. Okay, here goes. There are two kinds of people in the world, and I can prove it. There's one group of people that believes that there are two kinds of people in the world. There's another group of people who do not believe that there are two kinds of people in the world. So there, I just proved that there are two kinds of people. But because I proved it, there should no longer be people who do not believe that there are two kinds of people, because I've given definitive proof that there definitely are two kinds of people, those that believe and those that don't. But once I've convinced everyone that there are two kinds of people, because of my perfect logic, there are no longer two kinds of people. Now everyone believes that there are two kinds of people. There are only people who do believe there are two kinds of people because they accepted my proof. But now that's no longer true. because everyone now believes there are two kinds of people. And that means now there's only one kind of person, namely those that believe. I convinced everyone. And now they're wrong. And so on, with infinite circular reasoning. So who knows? In an alternate universe, there may have been many famous Young's theorems. I might have been a pioneer of string theory and solved the ultimate theory of everything. But I didn't have sufficient math background to prove it, and apparently no one else does either. Or if they did, string theory would be widely accepted as the theory that explains all the physics. Or I might have become famous for describing what's the worst kind of teacher to have when you're an insecure college student. I still vote that having two teachers married to each other is still the worst. Or people could have bought into my ridiculous Young's theorem that true is true and false is false, no matter how trivial that observation is. Actually, I wish more people realized that. These days, our political discourse includes various ridiculous phrases, such as alternate facts. People don't accept provable truth. Coming up with ridiculous theorems is the kind of insanity that arises when you're overwhelmed as a college student. Fortunately, I had Mr. and Mrs. Dr. Gersting guiding me through that insanity, and somehow I came out on the other end okay. I've got more stories to tell about the Gerstings, but we're going to go off topic next week to celebrate my history as a fan of motorsports, especially IndyCar racing, because we're coming up on the month of May in Indianapolis, which is the time of the Indy 500. After that, we'll return to my college stories, and the Gerstings will play a big role in many of those stories. I don't want to skip ahead and tell those stories now. I'll tell it all in chronological order, with the other events of my life at that time. If you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 per month. You'll get early access to the podcast and other exclusive content. Although my finances are a mess, I'm not in this for the money, but every little bit helps. As always, my deepest thanks to my financial supporters. I still cannot express how much I appreciate everything you do for me. Even if you cannot provide financial support, please post links and share this podcast on social media so I can grow my audience. I just want more people to be able to hear my stories. All my back episodes are available, and I encourage you to check them out if you're new to the podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or other feedback, please feel free to respond wherever you find this podcast. I'll see you next week as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe, everyone.